great to be here again in a conversation among friends. So
it is great to be here and to be in conversation, and I'm looking forward to talking with you, Peter. I have my notes in case I get stage fright.
Yeah, I also have notes, but I'm not sure whether we need them actually. But
yeah.
So we have 4 different topics that we wanted to touch upon. I think the sort of high-level topic is the miseducation of AI.
Yeah.
And you know, the obviously the first topic, just to give a high-level overview, AI paradigms. Where are we today? AGI, superintelligence. Where do we go from there? What are the risks? Agentic AI, other risks, and then eventually looking at US, Europe, US and Europe, or US versus Europe, and then a bonus topic at the very end. So why don't we kick off with AI paradigms? Where are we, and when will we see AGI and superintelligence?
I love this question because it requires me to do like a 1-hour history lesson if you want to actually dig in. Yeah. I think if the struggle with this type of question is that almost all of the terms we invoked are not technical terms of art. They are marketing terms or aspirational terms, but we're not talking about something specific, even when we talk about AI, let alone AGI. Superintelligence is a sort of sci-fi concept, not augured in a technical reality. And so we can think of these almost as unaugured or floating signifiers that get, over the 80-year history of the term AI, have been filled with very different meanings, have referred to very different technical approaches, all of which were aspiring to create something that kind of did things that humans do, at least according to various assessments. And so right now, we are in a very particular moment where the term AI, which was coined to mean something very different, refers almost completely in the general technical and public discourse to large-scale neural networks, to the deep learning approach, which became very, very popular in the early 2010s, largely because the platform business model had the economies of scale and the data via its platforms and network effects to reanimate deep learning as a going concern, to reanimate and kind of bring back from the archives approaches that were created in the late 1980s, early 1990s, then dropped because they didn't deliver on their promises. That's what's called an AI winter. And then came back into vogue because, oh, wow, we can use the parallelization capabilities of GPUs. We can use all of the surveillance data collected by the platform companies, which were the first to recognize how useful these could be. And we can make these do things. We can make them dance in ways that they weren't able to dance before. So we're now living in that age. Every step in AI, all the progress we talk about is still in the deep learning paradigm. It's scaling laws are sort of one of the big buzzwords around Slush. But that's one paradigm of AI. That is one approach. And my critique, one of my primary critiques of this approach is it ultimately relies on the type of concentrated power that is in the hands of tech monopolies that are largely based in the US and to some extent in China, due to historical factors that sort of allowed them to grow their reach, allowed them to grow their networks and economies of scale, which is a business model that is very hard to interrupt once it's established. So that's, there are many other approaches is the good news here. There are many other approaches to AI to fill that signifier that don't require that scale and that have been largely ignored because that has sort of taken up all of the room under the appellation AI.
So the boring part here is that they put on stage 2 people that actually agree. Right?
Yeah.
So
well, you guys can take a nap.
So I've said that I've said that these are just A to B mappings, right?
Yeah.
And obviously neural networks are universal function approximators. They will approximate any function out there. That's been proven. But we are teaching the machines to approximate very specific functions. And so that you end up with that conclusion. Two things. You did not answer the question when AGI or when superintelligence.
I'm so good at media training, I can just avoid it.
But if we look at different modalities, I mean, if you A to B mappings, tokens, pixels, whatever, what we're seeing now is these chatbots and assistants creating value in the world. But then we have different modalities like life sciences, say automotive, material sciences, gaming, visual media, entertainment, and so forth. How do you look at sort of what's coming? What's the next paradigm? How does this paradigm evolve? And then when do we get to AGI and superintelligence?
Yeah. I want your answer to that as well. But I think I reject inevitability as just a political stance. And so I think what's coming is what we create in a large sense, and kind of allowing the narratives of the large companies to sort of drive us toward creations that are convenient for them and their business model, and assuming that's a synonym for scientific progress doesn't serve us. So I think part of what I hope / want to help create as a future is a much more heterogeneous field of AI development. So when we're looking at automotive, look at the problems that need to be solved for that industry, look at issues of data integrity, look at issues of local context. I've heard a number of my friends, just anecdotally, who are in the UK where they drive on the wrong side of the road, where driving norms are a little bit different, talking about their Teslas driving like an American, right? That's a very shallow example of a much deeper problem. Like if your data isn't rigorous, if your distribution isn't robust as a proxy for the reality in which you want to deploy, your system will be janky, to use a technical term. And so I think that's, what I'm describing there is actually a market that could be opened up if we take those types of problems seriously, and if we're willing to experiment with approaches to AI that aren't, again, just white labeling a large scale a foundation model API and applying that in one or another context. Did that win AGI?
I don't you gave the AGI question back to me, right?
Yeah. And I mean, what is your definition of AGI, or how do you view that kind of aspirational North Star / sci-fi concept?
So you're doing exactly the same that I'm doing. I usually give it back and then I ask for the definition. So I don't think.
Well, I think we both spent time in academia, so that's.
But okay, let's move on. I know you've been talking about risks with AI, very specific, but let's broaden up first. And what I've oftentimes said is that while I don't know how this technology would get us to AGI and superintelligence and risks related to that, I think at the same time we have, for the first time in human history, in mass distribution, technology that fulfills the Turing test. So we as humans cannot distinguish between machines and humans. And you can do bad things with such technology. There are certain risks with it. And of course, the risk as such is a broader question. So why don't you sort of open up? How do you look at risks with AI today?
I mean, I think there are the broader risks, which to me kind of track down to the fact that we are, effectively outsourcing or delegating increasingly core decision making to systems that are not open for inspection, that hide behind walls of trade secrecy, that can be perturbed or rewritten based on the objective function of the organization that ultimately owns them. And we're doing that. But states, institutions, corporations are doing that under the guise of adopting this, this make or break technology, not actually understanding, the risks of that type of delegation, of those types of dependencies. So that is, to me, just a high-level risk of the current moment we're in, and the kind of FOMO-induced race to integrate these systems into every part of our institutional and economic life. The specific risks we're worried about at Signal, that are kind of, obsessing our team right now are very existential and kind of, a smaller version of that, which is the implementation of so-called AI agents, which are, kind of bots that do things on your behalf without asking permission to achieve one or another task, through a number of steps, right? And these are being integrated into the operating system. They're being integrated at the application level. You see kind of intermediation as the kind of business model that's developing through these agentic systems. And the thing that agents need to have in order to work is access to all of your data. And I've given examples of this, but it's like to book a car to a party and let your friends know you're going, like the most mundane example, like things you could do with your thumbs while you're waiting, right? Letting an agent do that requires access to a huge amount of data and kind of the permissions to run roughshod throughout your digital life in ways that really mirror kind of are creating very unsafe architectures from a privacy and cybersecurity perspective. So being integrated at sort of within your operating system, demanding access to your calendar, your credit card, your Signal data, all sorts of things that ultimately create vectors for attack that are very, very risky, and that even 5 years ago inside one or another tech company would have been stopped by the the security team before they were sort of launched. But so I think for Signal, we see that as a danger because we work at the application layer and we can guarantee the security and privacy of Signal. We have open source code that is audited. We have a protocol whose implementation is open and can be scrutinized. What we do within that sort of bubble of Signal is very robust. But we have to trust the operating system. We are running within a dependent system, and if an agent is implemented by the operating system provider, by iOS or Android, in ways that are demanding access to Signal data, that creates what is effectively a backdoor that can ultimately mean our reason for existing no longer exists. So that's, so if anyone wants to help stop that, I would love some help there. Thank you, friends.
I love that. I love that example because it really exemplifies certain potential risks, and it's clear that for Signal, sort of privacy lies at the core, of what you do. But I mean, if we step a few steps back, and the way you commented in the beginning, sort of the risks, not only for Signal but for everyone. I mean, what is your take on how do you actually then tackle that? Well, I mean, it's a trade-off, obviously. But we can see the world tapping into this technology. The technology is creating value. Yeah. We want the world to continue to create value with the technology. How do we do it safely?
Yeah. Well, I flip that, right? It's not how do we do this safely. It's like, what do we want to achieve? And what do we do to achieve that, right? Is it an agentic system? Or do we need something that is a bit more frictionful? Because that friction is actually what preserves the values we want, which include the fundamental human right to private communication, on which militaries, governments, corporations, boardrooms, journalists, human rights workers, anyone who wants a full, rich life in which you're not afraid that those who have power over you can weaponize your intimate information to do you harm, can persist, right? Like, that is fundamental. This is not a trivial thing that we sort of trade off. This is something that we need to create a livable future. So that is an invariable. What systems can we build that respect and honor that? And I think that is then the question of, what's an agent? Well, it's a software and hardware architecture that employs a handful of models usually to do things and make things more convenient. Okay, how can that exist in a world where we recognize that this value is sacrosanct and that we can't undermine it in pursuit of, an earnings call or in pursuit of a good I/O presentation, right? Because a lot of the things these agents are doing, at least at the consumer level, are not actually, they're not solving or preserving something sacrosanct. They're like, getting our grocery order wrong, right? It's, like, so what are we actually trading off, and how do we sort of put these values more clearly on the, horizon we're moving toward? And then, to me, that, like, creativity needs limits, right? Like, that is where innovation comes from. All right, we are never going to touch that. Okay, what can we do that's new? What markets can we make? What things can we create? What things do we sort of avoid and how do we do that becomes a much more interesting question than how do we make a new agent that's valued at $1 billion.
So, as we're moving towards this discussion between or of the US and Europe, is regulation a solution to that?
I mean, I think regulation is just necessary as a baseline. Like, the idea that regulation is a bad word or is always sort of inhibitory toward innovation, I think it's strange, and it's a sort of convenient trope, but it's not real. I think regulation, you want clean drinking water. You need, if you're going to rely on these infrastructures as a nervous system of our world, they need to be robust. They should be scrutable, so we should be able to look at them and verify, like, if we are outsourcing our infrastructure, our decision-making, our information ecosystem to these infrastructures, we should know what they do. We should be able to govern them in a way that is democratic. We should be able to, change them if they're not working for us. All of those things, like, we're grown-ups, right? So that, those are pretty basic, and regulation is something that creates the framework within which everyone is kind of playing on the same level, and there isn't an incentive to be like, okay, well, we're going to build inscrutable technologies that are actually grifters or, actually fake, make a bunch of money, and, then cry when we say regulation is hindering that. So I think regulation is necessary and can set up guardrails that actually incentivize very interesting innovation. But I would love your take on that as I turn it back to you.
Yeah, no, and let's move on to basically talking about. No, I'll answer.
Yeah.
I'll answer, and because I think eventually the broader question really is, how are we approaching those topics in Europe? Are we approaching those topics in Europe? Oftentimes it's seen as a complaint that Europe has too much regulation. It's impossible to operate in Europe. To a certain extent, I would agree. But I don't think that's the only problem, and I don't think that's the only thing that depicts the tech environment or environment for AI and technology companies in Europe. So I think we should take a broader perspective, and while I've oftentimes pointed out that the lack of a single market or the fact that the market is extremely fragmented in Europe is a challenge, and that is a regulation question as well. It's a legislation regulation question, but it's not only about sort of that being European. It's not actually European. It's different in every single country. And to me, that's a much bigger problem than the fact that sort of, we just have too much regulation in Europe. But then, of course, there are other things that depict the ecosystems in and environments in the US and Europe. So I'd love to hear your perspective on having spent time in both Europe and the US now.
I mean, I think, like, on a level of affect and just sort of vibe, as they say, it's kind of confusing to me the lack of confidence I see in Europe. It's like I described it earlier as, like, you have a very beautiful, very charismatic, very brilliant friend who's just gone through a breakup and is just, like, on the floor and you're like, what on earth? Like, for him? Come on, girl. And I think it's, it's a bit like, yeah, if you're competing in a rigged game and then not realizing it's rigged, maybe you feel bad about losing. But you're never going to create a new hyperscaler in the same paradigm, because what you're talking about is natural monopolies that were allowed to evolve with state support from the 1990s via the US government through very particular set of regulations that I'm not going to go into now. You're welcome. But, but nonetheless, like, kind of accreted this form, concretized it, and now there's a sort of aphasia of a lot of that history in the dominant tech discourse that leads to, I think, this mistake where it's like, okay, how does Europe catch up to having an Amazon? How does Europe catch up to having a Google, not recognizing that there are only limited things that these companies can actually do, right? Again, this is one narrow paradigm of AI which is the dominant tech paradigm right now. There are a lot of other markets that need to be served. There are defense markets that require robust security, require scrutability, require methodological integrity of the data that represents, say, the battlefield, in order to do something that is very, very serious, and if it's executed poorly, will be evidenced with death, with harm, right? And I think there is a market there. There is an opportunity there. There's an opportunity in finance. There's an opportunity in other high-stakes domains, healthcare, to move away from a model that is more flimsy, that is not providing the trustworthy and scrutable solutions that are needed, to something that is much more rigorous. And I think, again, chasing a natural monopoly form that evolved a long time ago and is now sort of dominant is a losing game. It's losing because it's rigged. And there are a lot of other opportunities to play another game where you can win.
So the final topic, as you just touched upon defense, you obviously you've had opinions on defense before, and you said that you just said that you need technology that is adaptive to the battlefield. How do you look at what are the requirements in defense, and how should Europe and Finland, obviously with the longest border to our eastern neighbor, has not only talked about competitiveness and growth in technology, but security, and that's also what I've said and what I believe is important. But you can look at that, from through the lens of big tech, through the lens of smaller technology companies. What's your take?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Finland has been a big friend to Signal, I think partly because of the awareness of how important security is and how important private communications are to maintaining security. So thank you for that. I think on the topic of defense generally, I think what I'm expressing is not really, defense exists. Militaries exist. I'm not expressing like a take on whether they're good or bad. I've, famously, or, if you're basic, infamously, protested large defense contracts at Google, put my reputation and my career on the line out of deep concern, sort of echoing Eisenhower's departure speech, for those of you who know his invocation of the military-industrial complex and the real dangers of accreting so much power in the hands of an industry that was sort of vested in war. But looking at Google, knowing this industry well, recognizing the staggering amount of highly intimate data that company had based on its surveillance business model of people across the globe, I think yoking the interests of a massive surveillance company to one nation's military, whatever it is simply structurally dangerous. That said, if we're talking about the technologies that defense is going to use anyway, that are required for these, I think they need to be robust. They need to be purpose-built. They need to be evaluated based on the actual needs of the defense forces that are using them, all of which are things that these massive systems that are sort of general purpose, one-size-fits-all, proprietary, don't actually do. So when I look at this, I look at defense as a potential market, a demand side for a much more rigorous approach to technological building and innovation and just security, privacy, a lot of the needs that are not met by the hyperscaler technologies. So it's I think that is the potted version of my take there.
We agree again, right?
Yeah, so boring.
So no, I truly believe that you need to sort of build adaptive technology in defense, because the environment towards which you operate is changing. Not only because sort of we're living in a changing world, but the opponent has one task, and that's to change the environment so that AI, physical AI, embodied intelligence, or whatever you call it, is not working. Yeah. So we have a few seconds left. Let's end with Meredith's statement before we basically close the session.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my statement is that I agree with that, Peter. And I think again, that is a huge opportunity for actual innovation, which requires creativity outside of the dominant paradigm, where there is a huge amount of talent and a huge amount of opportunity in Europe and in many other places to solve problems that really matter. Like, how do you build adaptive technology that is rigorous and scrutable and creates a future worth living in, not just value for investors in the short term?
Very good. Thank you.